All right. So, Karen, the question today
Oh,
is, was the fall predestined?
okay.
Which is not an easy question. You know,
Oh,
I struggle a lot with these questions and figuring out even kind of what angle I'm going to take on it.
I
Um,
was gonna say, I'm not even sure I know what that means.
so where I decided to start is with the words, the terminologies that are in the question.
Good,
What
good.
what does it even mean? So I want us to talk about what is predestined and what is the fall. And then we can maybe talk about, was the fall predestined?
Okay.
So when we're talking about predestination, we're talking about um, the the role that God takes in deciding stuff that happens. And most of the time, when theologians are talking about predestination, they're talking about, in particular, the immortal state of the souls of individual humans. So whether that person is saved or not, whether that person is saved or condemned, or whether that person is going to heaven or hell. Um, it doesn't have to mean that, but that typically is where people go with it. So I think the first most important, one of the most important things to keep in mind when we're thinking about this question is the difference between foreknowledge and predestination, because there are circles where there is an understanding that God knows what is going to happen, and we talked about that when we did the question, um, how does God experience time? That if God exists outside of time and is kind of experiencing all of time all at the same time, um, then it would make sense that God would know. From our perspective, God knows the future, because for God, it's not the future, it's the present. But that's different than predestination, because in predestination, it's not just that God knows what's going to happen, it's that God decides what's going to happen. God causes that thing to happen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so those are two different things that you can be aware that something is happening. I am aware that right now my dog is laying next to me, but I didn't cause that to happen. If I tried, then she probably would run away because she doesn't want me to tell her what to do. Um, but I could force her to. I could decide that she's going to be there, and then she would wiggle and squirm and try to run away. Um, so there's a difference between God knowing that something is going to happen and God deciding that something is going to happen. And in predestination, the assumption is that it's not just that God knows it's going to happen, but God chose for it to happen.
Yeah.
Now there are different understandings of predestination. Um, there are understandings in the early church, and this is extremely oversimplified because there's lots of different perspectives and lots of different people that you can read and what they had to say about this idea. For a while, predestination was considered heretical, and then it wasn't, and all kinds of stuff happening. But in the early days of Christianity, predestination was often thought about in terms of whether God cares about something or whether God cares to get involved in something. So there are things that are God's will. It is God's will that, and depending on the person, it can be almost anything. It is God's will that I be sitting on this couch wearing a white shirt on this particular day. Um, but then there are also things, areas that God doesn't really care about. There, God is disinterested. God is um, not going to get involved in that particular area of human existence, human life. So, God, it may be God's will that I live in California, but God doesn't really care whether I eat a turkey sandwich or a BLT for lunch today. And so I get to decide that. That's kind of where my free will resides. And then there are um, events, choices, decisions that occur that God is actively displeased with. It is not God's will that this thing happen, um, but it happens anyway because of human action. And that, for people who have that kind of understanding, they would say that that is sin. That when you act in a way that is against God's will, then that is sin. You can do a lot of things that are not sinful, even though they are not part of God's will, because God is disinterested. God doesn't care. You can choose, to wear the white shirt or the blue shirt, and God will be fine with that. But then there are also events or choices that God doesn't actively does not want, but because we have free will, we're able to make those choices. Um, but then the question becomes, if if so much of my life in terms of God's will is predestined, God chose it for me, then do I really get the choice to do things that God doesn't want? If God is actively displeased with a particular choice or particular event, why does God allow it to happen, um, or perhaps make it happen? If you have a very um, high understanding or high belief in God's sovereignty, if God is in control of everything and then chooses certain areas because of disinterest for us to make choices, then for those people, they have to kind of grapple with the idea that God is actively causing sin to happen because God controls us like little puppets on a string. So there are endless ways of agreeing or disagreeing with this. But when we're talking about this question of predestination, everybody really falls somewhere in here. It just kind of depends on which questions you're asking and which areas are most offensive to you, I think. Are you offended by the idea that God would cause bad things to happen? Well, in that case, you're probably going to bring your understanding of God's sovereignty down a few ticks, or at least maybe you believe that God is fully sovereign and can do anything, but that God chooses to be self-limited so that we can have free will, or something like that. So all of these things are all kind of rattling around in all of this. And then, of course, as somebody who was educated in the Presbyterian world, it would be terrible of me not to mention that, of course, predestination is the big thing for John Calvin. And his idea was not just that humans are predestined, that God decides for humans, but there's actually double predestination. There are humans that are chosen for salvation to go to heaven, and there are humans who are chosen for condemnation to go to hell. Well,
Oh,
I don't like that. A lot of people don't like that.
I don't like that.
um, and so, over the course of time, various Reformed Protestants have kind of thought about this and reconfigured it. And the most famous of these re-understandings of double predestination comes from Karl Barth, who was a theologian in the 1930s. And he also believed in double predestination, but he doesn't believe that predestination is of humans. He believes that predestination applies to Jesus. And so basically, God is choosing um, Christ for both salvation and condemnation. And so, in choosing Christ for both of those things, he takes on everything about us as humans, and then therefore we are released from our um, our bondage to that predestination, to condemnation, because since we're all sinful, that's what we deserve and that's what we get. That's what we're chosen for in the words of predestination. So those are some of the things that are kind of going on with predestination. There isn't a whole lot in our Bible that supports the idea of predestination, but I wanted to just take a look at a few things. Um, in the Psalms, there's a lot of ideas about um, God being in control and God being aware of everything about me. So Psalm 139 says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely." Now you notice this one is not actually predestination. This one is just foreknowledge, right? God knows what I'm doing, when I'm doing it. God is there with me. God knows what I'm going to say next. But there's a sense of comfort in that idea that God that we call that God's providence, God's presence with us. That there's always hope. I am known. I think one of the deepest needs of humanity in general is to be known, and the comfort that we have in knowing that we are known to the depths of our core by God, I think is a deep comfort to all people. And I think too, it helps in that there's less at stake in our choices if we have this sense that God is aware of it, that God is guiding it all in some way. So I think there is, um, I think there's a lot to be said for belief in predestination, even though it can get into some really tough places because, we can start asking questions about, well, does God really condemn people, choose people to be condemned and all these types of things. But the idea that God is in control, I think can be a comfort for us because we don't, it's it's kind of like the transition from childhood into adulthood, that first time that you realize that there's nobody that's going to fix it for you. You have to figure it out on your own. Um, when we have this idea of God's providence, of God's predestination, we can feel a little bit better because we've got a little bit more limitation in our world that just like a child, a parent puts up baby gates or something to keep their child from making too many choices outside of what they're capable of. If we believe that God is present with us and kind of guiding our choices and limiting our choices in some ways, there's a level of comfort to that. But it is on the flip side of that same coin, we can sometimes get angry that, well, what about free will, and don't I have the freedom to make my own choices and all those kinds of things. Not to mention the idea that you can't hide from God, and so um, if you if a word is on my tongue and I know that God knows it completely, then that's comforting when I don't know what to say in a situation. But it can be a little bit intimidating to think about that when what the thing I'm about to say is something that I know is not nice or I probably shouldn't say. Um, and then additionally, I think one of the potential downfalls of this is there's less personal responsibility for the choices that we make. Oh, well, God wanted me to do that, or well, it's not that bad because God allowed me to do it, or something like that. So there's definitely kind of multiple angles to take when we're thinking about this issue. Um, and then here is one of the only places in the whole Bible that uses the word predestined. It's from Romans chapter 8, and it says, "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn within a large family. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Um, so I think this passage, we have to remember that um, with the Bible, the Bible is a record of the reflections of people who are trying to understand the big questions about the world. And typically, we don't do a whole lot of that when things are going well for us. And so a lot of what we have in our Bible is the record of God's people trying to find meaning and purpose and hope in the face of pain and suffering. Um, or they are stories that are meant for the audience of people who are experiencing pain and suffering. And so when we look at something like this, we kind of have to think about it from that perspective that, the words of themselves say that God did these things. Um, but where does that fit um, into this bigger understanding of who God is and who we are? Um, because I just picked out this smaller part, but there are, provisos and pro quos about human behavior and human response to God's predestination, that Lutherans certainly have a hard time with because we rely so heavily on grace in our theology. So how do we understand what it means to be foreknown and predestined and conformed, um, and then called and justified and glorified? All these things are, these big words within Christian theology, and each one of these could be its own question, for for one of these nights. What does it mean to be glorified? What is glorification? And there are different understandings of that depending on your denomination. So I guess all that to say, yes, predestination is mentioned here. Um, and what is it that we are being predestined for? We are being predestined for conforming to the image of the Son. Does that mean that only certain people are predestined or that everyone is predestined? This particular little chunk doesn't give us the answer to that. If we looked at the wider context, then it might give us a little bit more clue about who we're talking about here. But remembering that context and why Paul was writing this in the first place is really important for us to keep in mind, when we're looking at that. So any questions or comments up to this point? We're good? Okay.
Yeah, I think.
So when we're thinking about God's providence or the idea of predestination, which always then comes into with issues of human freedom, we have some issues that we have to keep in mind. And I'm just going to bring up all of these at the same time. So we've got the question of God's knowledge. And I can never say this, prescience. It's a weird word. Um, did God know that it would happen? Did God make it happen? If omnipotence, if God is able to do anything and something happens, then God wanted it to happen. Or maybe God isn't omnipotent and God didn't want it to happen, but was powerless to stop it for some reason. So then we get into that ageless question. If God is omnibenevolent, all good, omnipotent, or omnipotent, um, able to do anything in any way, in any place, and omniscient, um, aware of everything that's going on at all times in all places. Why is there suffering? And this is a question that everybody at some point in their life has asked, even if they don't use these words. Why is this happening to me? Um, it's the Job question. It's Jesus' question on the cross. God, why have you forsaken me? Why is it that this is happening to me? Um, this is unfair. If you truly love me, you wouldn't let this happen to me. And then we start to rationalize and try to figure out, well, we can't possibly have a world of human freedom if, you know, if God is in control of everything and always controls everything. And so the fact that there's sin in the world is because of human free will. And but would it be possible for us to live without sin, um, and still have free will? And all these questions continue to come up. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, after we talk a little bit about the fall. But that's kind of where we end up most of the time when we're talking about this idea of being predestined. We end up in this place of, uh, well, if God has the power to predestine things, then why didn't God just, put everybody where they were supposed to be and keep them there? Um, and to a degree, it's a mystery, something that we can't answer. But it's also something I think that is part of our human call to continue to wrestle with through our lives, and that maybe not find answers, but find hints of answers and ways of finding wisdom rather than knowledge in this area, perhaps. So, anything to say about what is predestined before we talk about what is the fall? Good.
Well, it seems to me like there's a lot going on there in that. I mean, I think I've come to believe that things just happen. And it's, you know, people say, well, if God knew that was going to happen, why didn't he stop it? But at the same time, people do have free will and things happen out of that. I mean, just I don't know, that doesn't make sense, but I don't know. It's a really thorny question because why doesn't he stop it? Why, if he knows that this is going to happen, why doesn't he stop it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, but
Well, and then I look at it in terms of the small event in the big picture. Maybe he allows this particular incident to happen, but it's because he can see so far into the future and he already has written the ending, that there are lessons for us to learn along the way.
And that's definitely one of the main arguments, the main responses to that question. And I think in some circumstances that is legitimate. But then we have to be really careful, because if we take any one potential answer and we say, well, this is the answer, there's always a situation that will challenge it, right? That you can say that, like, oh, well, I stubbed my toe this morning, and that must mean that God doesn't care about me because that was really painful. But then later in the day, I you know, I end up, going to the doctor because I stubbed my toe and I find out that I have I have cancer, but God, now it can be cured because they found it early enough, or, all those types of stories that come up. I think that's okay. to answer those questions that way. But then there are other situations where it's okay, well, if God causes bad things to happen to teach us a lesson, do we really have the arrogance to be able to say, oh, well, God sent that earthquake to destroy Haiti to teach us a lesson, or God caused that car accident to kill all those people to teach somebody a lesson. Like that doesn't still fly anymore. You get to certain points, and our answers just always crumble under the weight of human suffering. And I think that's kind of where we have to say what is important here. And for me, I think the way that I handle it, it's not an answer, but the way that I handle it is to say, I'm asking the wrong question, because I'm asking, why didn't God do something about this? God is already doing something about it. God is here with me as I suffer. God is with the person who is suffering. There is a mystery to all of it, because certainly I believe that God is capable of fixing everything or preventing everything that's bad from happening to people. But what I do know, and what I have been promised, and what I do put my faith in, is that when those things do happen, regardless of why or how, in that intellectual way, we have that connection to God, because God promises to be there with us, to be mourning with us, to be grieving with us, to be trying to push forward with us. And that presence, I think, is in some situations the only source of hope in dealing with those situations. You can sit around and you can cry and you can ask why, and I think that there's value in that. It's part of the grieving process, but you have to eventually get out of that state, right, in order to survive, in order to move forward in some way, no matter how awful the situation is that you find yourself in. And so, to remember, that there are other questions besides why, to be asking, I think is kind of an important part of it. Where is God in this? Well, I don't think I could say that God is, in the whatever, in the rocks that caused the landslide that, smashed a whole town. But I do know that God is in the hospital next to people who got hurt. God is, in the rooms with the families that are mourning the losses of their loved ones, those types of things. And so those questions, I think, can be answered, and um, should be part of the conversation too.
Well, a lot of it is just comes from being human. I mean, being alive on this earth, there's no way that things aren't going to happen to you. I mean, but God's there
Mm-hmm.
to support you, even though you may make the wrong decision or you do something really dumb. Uh, God's still there. Um, I mean, after everything that I've been through this past year, if I hadn't had God with me, I probably would have given up and
Mm-hmm.
just gone. I mean, it's like, what's the point,
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
I kept getting up and I kept getting knocked down again. But God was there. I mean, and I think that's just part of being human. It's not why me, it's why not you.
Mm. Yeah,
You know,
good point.
what makes you so special that these
Yeah.
things shouldn't happen in your life?
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Anyway,
Yeah. All right. Well, are we ready to move on to the other half of our question?
yes.
All right. So we've got predestination. Now we've got the fall. And a lot of times, this is where I was before I took a class on the Hebrew scriptures in college. Um, People assume that the fall is just a thing that everybody agrees with and everybody understands it the same way, but that's actually not the case, which is really interesting. When I took that class, and it was one of the first things we did, because you start at the beginning of the book, right? You open it and you read chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then you get to chapter 3, and now we're on this very basic theological thing that the Christian church has been doing for a long time. And then all of a sudden I find out that, well, there's a whole other possible way to understand this. And then that just kind of breaks open the whole thing. And now I understand that our interpretations of these things are not even consistent within the Christian church. But before we get into that, I want to look at the story a little bit itself. I didn't put the whole thing in here because it is the whole chapter 3, but I wanted to pull out a few important details, a few important images. So we've got the snake comes and says, "Hey, is it true that God told you that you couldn't, if you ate from this tree, you would die?" And Eve replied, "God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Then the Lord God said," this is a little bit further down the story. "Then the Lord God said, 'See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever.' Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken." So there's a lot going on in that story. Is the fall about death? It says, "If you eat of the tree, you will die." Is the fall about good and evil? You will know the difference between good and evil, which would be the beginning of the concept of having ethics, understanding, having the wisdom to discern what is good and evil in the world. Um, the story is about wanting to be wise, which I think is a valuable thing. Solomon, we have a whole story about this, right? That Solomon is told that he can have anything he wants, and he asks for wisdom, and God is pleased with that. Well, Eve wants wisdom, but then she doesn't. She gets in trouble for that. Why is that? Well, maybe because it was a shortcut to getting wisdom. That short wisdom is something that you have to um, earn. You have to learn over time through your mistakes, through your living, through your relationships. Is that the problem? There's the concept of nakedness. It talks about how the people became aware that they were naked. And nakedness, of course, refers not just to physical nakedness, but other types of nakedness, awareness of our vulnerability as humans, that we are physically vulnerable to the elements, to stronger animals, to eating the wrong thing and being poisoned. But then we're also vulnerable emotionally and socially and spiritually. That when we try to hide ourselves, we try to cover ourselves, our personalities, because we're afraid that people are going to judge us, they're not going to accept us. Like I was mentioning before, as one of the fundamental human needs to belong, we are therefore vulnerable, because we have to rely on something that is not us to accept us and make us feel like we belong, and that creates vulnerability. So does it have to do with that? Um, it says that they have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and have become like us, like God. So what does that mean? What does it mean that we have become like God in in this eating of the tree. So there are, there are other questions that aren't specifically in the text, but we've got other issues going on that we have to kind of contend with too, of the consequences of this. Are the consequences of our actions, of our sins, of the sins in this particular episode, are they natural consequences? Are they divine consequences that God gives, or are they both in some ways? That we assume as Christians, because we were taught it in this way, that God is punishing the people, God is punishing the serpent for this behavior. But not everybody thinks about it that way. That there are natural consequences to being able to choose, because when we make a decision, and when we then have to take responsibility for that decision and the consequences that come with that decision, um, that is how we exercise our free will. That's also how we grow. That's how we develop. So when we're talking about that, that desire for wisdom, um, is it such a bad thing that this happened? Um, and most people who kind of exist in the world of Jewish theology don't think so. They don't see this. They don't call this episode the fall, because they see it more not as the source of original sin. They see it as the source um, of human relationships to each other and to God, to the establishment of the true relationship of the people of God and God. Because by having choice, we then are something that is not God. If all we ever did was exactly what God wanted us to do, do we really have choice? Do we really have the ability to choose if we never sin, if we never do something that isn't what God wants us to do? Um, I guess technically we could always choose to do what pleases God, and that's still a choice. Um, but is it completely a choice if that's, is it, if it's, I guess if it's an option, then it's still out there. You could still do it, even if nobody ever actually took you up on it, or took God up on it. Um, but then if you never have your own opinion, if you never disagree, are you two different people, or are you just the same person? And that's kind of boring, and part of, I think, the the idea of creating was that God desired to be in relationship with something that is not God. And so, does this concept of the fall as a negative thing, is it required that we believe it is a bad thing, or can we kind of have this different understanding that it is an essential part of the human story? So that's, I guess, kind of what I wanted to get at. Questions, comments about that?
Well, I think that's what I was getting at a while ago when I was talking about being human. So the human vulnerability, that kind of comes home to me. But then the consequences, um, don't you think the consequences are always natural? I mean, if you have a choice and free will and you do something and there's consequences to that, there's consequences to everything. Isn't that natural?
Hmm.
It's not God saying, "Oh, you did that, so shit, there you go."
Right.
you
God
know?
is not zapping us for.
No, I don't think so. I think I've told this before, but when I was working with hospice, there was this woman and she's had lung cancer, and she was having so much trouble breathing, and she said, "This is my greatest fear, and look at what God has done to me. I can't breathe." And it made me so angry because I thought it went against everything that I feel. I don't, why would God pick you
Mm.
and make you suffer like that?
Mm-hmm.
Why would that happen? That it's just your body. I mean, you're a human being and human beings get sick.
There is an interesting arrogance in our uh, our blaming God for our suffering.
Yeah,
That, I of
yeah.
all people don't deserve this, God. So why are you, this is unfair. And that's an ancient story as well, still found in the
But
Job story.
yeah, I think it's just a natural, if, this is part of being human.
Hmm.
And we can't ever hope to be like God. I mean, I don't think I even stand a half a chance. You know, I don't think that's what it's all about.
No, no, I don't think so either.
Okay.
All right. Are we ready to dive into this both sides thing now?
Yeah.
So we've got predestination, we've got the fall. Both of these things are very confusing concepts. Nobody can agree on them. And now we're going to push them together and see what happens. And I'm going to introduce you to a new word today, lapsarianism. So the lapsari or something like that, lapsaria. Um, this refers to um, the fall. It means the fall, basically. And so the debate is over the logical order of events in relationship to the fall. So lapsarian means the fall. And we've got different understandings of how these things fit into logical order. And it's really important for us to try to remember that this is about logical order and not chronological order. But it's almost impossible for me. I'm just such a visual and time oriented person that I can't do it. But technically, this has nothing to do with chronology. I'm going to express it to you chronologically, but it has nothing to do with chronology. It has to do with logic. Logically, in what order do these things have to fall for this to make sense? And then how do we understand, who God is and who we are in relationship to that logic? But I'm going to express it to you chronologically because that's how my brain works. So just know that this has nothing to do with chronology, but that's what I've got. So there are two sides to this. There is the supralapsarians, and there are the infralapsarians. And supralapsarians are sometimes called prelapsarians, which would mean before lapsarian, the fall. So before the fall. And infralapsarians or post-lapsarians would mean post, after the fall. So that's what we've got going on here. But basically what is happening here is there's an argument, and this is mostly a Calvinist thing. So this is mostly in the Reformed tradition from the Reformation period. So Lutherans never really as interested in this. But I think this is important when we're talking about this idea of the fall being predestined or not. So I want to share this with you. Um, so infralapsarians, the people who believe um, in the post fall. So basically, what they're asking is, when does election take place? Does election take place before the fall or after the fall? And election is, of course, the decision about, what are you predestined for? And then the fall, and of course, this is again logically not event based. This is why I put events in quotation marks up there. If the fall is predestined, if the fall is inevitable, then at what point logically does that fit in relationship to election, to choosing who's going to be condemned and who's going to be saved? That's kind of what these people are arguing about here. Now, of course, I don't agree with either of them because I don't believe that there are people that are condemned and people who are saved. But we'll get into that part in a little bit. Let's just go with what these people want to say so that I can explain, what their differences are and why it's important. So the supralapsarians, the pre-lapsarians, the pre-fall people said that logically, you have to have God electing, choosing which box everybody's going to go in before they are created. Because when you choose which box they're going to go in before they're created, then you create them to fit into that box. So by I guess it would be similar to to the idea of God deciding, okay, I'm gonna create some kind of creature. I'm gonna create something, and I want it to live in the ocean. Well, that's going to affect the attributes of this thing. I need to make a fish, not a bird. It needs to go into the fish box, and so it has all these things. So you kind of have to decide first what kind of creature this is going to be before you actually create it. So that's kind of logically what's going on there. And then after everything is created, now the fall, the condemnation of all, because when in the fall everything is condemned, everything deserves condemnation. Then it is confirmed because there are elect creatures, or not everybody's elect in this situation. There are those elected for salvation, and then there are those who are elected for condemnation. That creates conflict, and the conflict ensures that the fall will happen. Everybody is condemned. And then, logically, from being condemned, we can then get to God's grace and God giving of salvation, just of course for those who were elected to be saved. This side of things highlights that God is in charge. It has to do with God's sovereignty. God is in complete control of everything. God already knows who you are going to be before you're even created. And so you really have no say in the matter at all, because before you're even created, you're already, I am a fish, but I wish that I could be a bird. Well, you can't, because the way that you were created is to be a fish. You've got gills, you've got a tail that swishes back and forth. You can't be a bird. You can't fly. It sounds a little harsher when you say, well, you were created fundamentally at the core of who you are condemned. That's a little harsher to say, but it's kind of the same thing in the minds of these people. So their focus logically is on how do we confirm and reinforce the concept of God's control over all things. And logically, God deciding who we're going to be before we're even created is the way to do that. Now, infralapsarians, the post-lapsarians, the people who believe that election took place after the condemnation of all, after the fall, these people believe that first we're created, then the fall happens and we're condemned, Then God chooses some of us to receive salvation. And the intention here is to highlight, rather than God's sovereignty, we're highlighting God's love. God creates us. God wants the best for us. We screw up. We're the ones who mess all of this up by falling. And what God should do is destroy all of us, condemn all of us. But instead, God chooses to save some of us. And so then the argument is, well, if you're offended by the idea that some people are condemned, remember that everybody is supposed to be condemned, but God decided to save some people. Well, that's not good enough for me personally, but some people, that's legitimately how they go about it. They believe that that is good enough. That yes, of course, who am I to suggest that God hasn't done enough, because God should not have given salvation to anyone. And so how dare I suggest that the fact that some people are condemned is wrong, is unjust, because it's not. The fact that some people are saved is unjust. So I bring this to you not because I think it's important for you to memorize this and, keep it in your back pocket for the rest of your life, because I'm sure you are never going to need to tell anybody about the difference between supralapsarians and infralapsarians. And if you try, they're probably going to look at you like you have 6 heads and think that you're talking a foreign language, because you kind of are. I bring this to you because I think it's important for us to, when we're starting to put these two ideas together, it's important for us to remember that what we're talking about here isn't just logical ideas, isn't just theology, logic about God. It fits into our understanding of God. The post-lapsarians highlighting God's love versus the pre-lapsarians highlighting God's sovereignty. For the most part, the pre-lapsarians lost, because for the Reformation in particular, which of course this was, part of the whole Calvinist thing, the idea that God's love surpasses God's desire to be in control is essential for them, even, and that kind of bleeds into the Lutheran side of the Reformation of God's grace. Yes, we all deserve to be condemned, but because God loves us, God gives us salvation anyway. In the Calvinist language, God chooses, God elects others who don't deserve it. Some people who don't deserve it. So anything about that we want to say? Did that make any sense at all?
Well, it makes sense, but gosh, what happens to the person who has not been elected for salvation but asks for grace?
So that's
Does
why
that make sense?
yeah, but so that's why your pre-lapsarian makes sense, because remember, this is not chronological, it's logical. So the fact that you ask that question means that the pre-lapsarians are right, because you are already elected before you're created. And so you can't, the fundamentals that make up who you are would prevent you from asking for grace. It's like, you can think of it in terms of the cartoony characters, types of tropes. If you've got the character that is the evil character, it might even have like the little horns and the pitchfork and wear the red suit and all that stuff. In the cartoon, that character is inherently evil. There is nothing about it that would cause it to ever consider being or doing good. And everything it does is selfish. Everything it does is about itself. Everything it does is intended to create chaos and harm others that are not itself. And so, in electing before creating, that fundamental power that God has over everything is ensured. Because if I am elected to be evil, then I am created to be evil. And then I can't be a bird. I have to be a fish. I have no choice. I wouldn't even consider being a bird. I don't even have a concept of what being a bird is. I've never seen a bird. I have never experienced anything other than water. And so I don't have any access to that. So that's why their logic fits. But I think, and the reason why I brought this up is because when we ask these questions and we find out that, there are whole systems that answer that question, then there's going to be something else wrong with it. Because now we've got, well, God is creating something for the purpose of creating something that is worthy of being condemned so that God can condemn it. And how do I fit that concept into the larger concept of who I understand God to be? And it just doesn't fit at all. And when that happens, we have to stop and we have to say, okay, so am I going to hold on to my bigger belief that I have been, working with and manipulating and tweaking over the course of my entire lifetime? Or is this particular thing that I am confronted with so big, so convincing, so fundamental that I have to reconsider everything? And I'm not saying that never happens. That is how I got to be where I am today. I had that experience and it was enough to make the whole system crash to the ground and I had to start all over again. But I don't think that an argument about where logically election has to fall is enough for me to stop believing that God is fundamentally about love. But that's me. There are people out there, there aren't very many, but there are people out there who are prelapsarians, even still today, because it makes more sense to them. But sometimes you gotta decide that faith doesn't make sense, right? That's the whole idea.
Exactly. Mhm.
All right, let's leave that behind. Stop thinking about that. Never think of those words ever again. And let's talk about um, possible understandings of why the fall happened. So we're trying to decide, was the fall predestined? Was the fall predetermined? Well, we have to first remember that our understanding of why the fall happened is going to be influenced, by our understanding of what is happening in the events of the fall, what the fall is. So we talked about, some of the possibilities of what's going on there. Is the fall a story about humans defying God and getting punished and sent out into a world where they don't belong? Or is the fall story not even a fall story? It's a story about people coming into their own. God gave them the opportunity to 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 lash out, to become their own people, to decide that they weren't going to just be God's pawns and playthings forever. They were going to reach further than that they wanted to be more than that. And in doing so, they are opened um, to the world of personal choices um, kind of ethics and decision making and responsibility and dealing with consequences and all the wonderful, horrible, beautiful, terrible things that it means to be human. I think that both of those potential understandings of the story and retellings of the story are legitimate to consider. And the fact that in Christian circles, we really only talk about and um, legitimize one of those is really sad because we're missing out on a whole different interpretation, a whole different understanding of, the fundamentals of where we come from and who we are. Um, and I don't know which one is the quote unquote correct interpretation. Maybe there isn't a correct interpretation. Maybe we're supposed to read it in multiple different ways. And of course, those are only two possible ways of reading it that I just laid out. But to remember that when we're thinking about this, even the fact that we call it the fall kind of implies that it's a bad thing, right? So maybe we need to reconsider even what we're calling it. I don't remember what Jewish circles call this story. There are several places in, especially in the early books, where Jews and Christians have a completely different understanding of of the story to the point that they have a completely different name for them, and this is one of them. Because it's not about falling down; it's about becoming, who we were intended to be, so that we can engage with God and grow and change and make choices and make mistakes and try again and all the things that make us human and engage in that relationship with God. But that said, so there are lots of different possibilities. Here are just some of the ones that kind of came to my mind. In the story, God asks the people, where are you? What's going on? Who told you that you were naked? Um, so maybe the story is trying to express that, at least at least within the bounds of the story itself, God isn't omniscient. God is, another character in the story that is in relationship with these humans, and God is, trying to test their faithfulness. Well, I asked you to not do this thing, and um, I want to see if you're gonna, if you're gonna follow through. Or maybe in the story, God is kind of mocking them, asking those questions. God already knows what's going to happen. Maybe even God has already decided, God has predestined what is going to happen. But God kind of, works within the bounds of the humans and pretends not to know what is going on. Maybe it's that. Maybe like I was saying a couple minutes ago, maybe it doesn't have to do with any kind of testing. Maybe it has to do with the establishment of something that is not God. Um, one of our earliest challenges as humans, and none of us ever remember it because we're infants when it's happening. But one of our earliest challenges is the realization that our caregiver, our source of comfort, and the meeting of our needs is not us. That there are things that are not us, that we can't control our environment. And so maybe this story is about that. Maybe it is about the establishment of the understanding that we are not God and God is not us. And once you figure that out, only then are you capable of being in relationship. Because if you're the same thing, you can't be in relationship. I can't be in a relationship with myself. That's weird. Thank goodness. I don't think I would want to hang out with myself. um, but for us to not be God, we have to have different concepts. We have to have different understandings of how the world works. And just to some degree, we have to have that conflict of desire, which is, how infants start. They start out by realizing, hey, I have a need and it isn't met instantaneously. In the womb, it is, because there is nothing else but them. But when they come out into the world, one of the first things that a baby learns is there are things that are not me in this world, and I have to rely on them to meet my needs. And it's not going to be instantaneous because they're not me. And so maybe that's what that's about. Maybe the story is about human freedom, and the fall happened because it was inevitable. By giving us freedom, it was one of those consequences. So it wasn't, maybe not that God predestined the fall, but that in giving us freedom, God knew that it was inevitable that we would act out in that way. Our nature requires it somehow. Which in that case, then you could go back and you could say that maybe it is predestined, because if we are by nature created to exert our freedom in that way, then God predestined us to act in that way, or some, to some degree. So maybe we are leaning toward yes on our question. Or, maybe it's random chance. Maybe we do have the capacity as humans to resist making choices that we know are not the choices that God wants us to make. Maybe every day we have that 50-50 shot at getting it right. And maybe somehow, in an alternative universe, nobody ever decided that they were going to find out what happens if they defy God. And somehow we three exist in a world like that. And then we get to decide every day whether we're going to get it right or not. I don't know. So those are all some possibilities. Do you have any other thoughts that I did not think of? No. All
My
right.
mind is blown right now, so it's beyond reason at all.
Well, then let's wrap it up. Getting back to our original question, was the fall predestined? Well, my answer is I have no idea. I don't know which one, I have certain of those possibilities on the last slide I like better than other ones, but there's not really any way to tell, what's right and what's wrong. In this case, I think it's really important though to talk about, and that's why I brought up that lapsarianism thing, because I think there are Christians who really like to debate and talk about stuff and have theological discussions, and I think that's really fun and I enjoy it. But I think sometimes those people go a little bit too far and forget that there are real life implications of their conversations, and that they need to fit that into their wider understanding of who God is. And um, there's a theologian named Brian Zond, and he said one of my favorite things on Twitter years ago now. He said, you might worship a God who, for example, creates humans just for them to be condemned. But I don't worship that God, because that is a monster God, and I don't want anything to do with your monster God. My God is a God of love. And I think it's really important that when we're having fun and we're debating these things and we're thinking about these things, it's important because it helps us to tweak our concepts and to develop relationships with each other. We have to be really careful about that. But we also shouldn't go on the other side and say, oh, well, those conversations are worth nothing and we shouldn't talk about it, and anti-intellectuals, because they are important conversations. It's important for us to think about these things for the sake of um, deepening our understanding and our faith for the sake of building relationships with one another and sharing our perspectives and thoughts on things and all that kind of thing. So it's really important to me to kind of walk that line of, why is this important? Not just accepting that it's important because it's a question, and also not just, saying, well, it's not important because it's intellectual. It doesn't have anything to do with feelings or, what have you. So all that said, I don't know if the fall was predestined or not, but I'm going to share two things with you by way of conclusion. The first one is a quote that I found while I was researching this from Augustine. And this is pulled out of context and is not in any way what he actually meant. But when I read it, this is what I got out of it. And so I bring it to you in this way, telling you that this is not what he meant, but being completely unapologetic in that what he said piqued something completely different in my mind that is actually the opposite of what he was trying to get at. He said, "For he promised what he himself would do, not what men would do." And this is in the context of him actually supporting predestination. But when I read this sentence, it reminded me, and I know I talk about this a whole lot, but this little 6-page excerpt from a book really had a huge impact on me and my theology and my faith. It reminded me of my little Moltmann thing that I've talked to you about before, where Moltmann talks about how before God decided to create, God had to make space, not like physical space, but like metaphysical space, I guess. Again, I'm a very visual, touchy person, so I have to think about these things in this way. But if you think about it as God making space for us, God is self-limiting, God is sacrificing, even in the act of creation. And therefore, we know that in creating us, God is already actually being sacrificed for the sake of redemption. And so when I read this from Augustine, he promised what he himself would do, not what men would do. I would say that if anything is predestined, it is God predestining what God is going to do, not God predestining what we are going to do. God makes promises, God decides what God is going to do. And when God makes a promise, when God decides, it is firm, it is something that we can rely on. But how we respond, what we do with it is up to us. Like I said, that is in no way what Augustine meant by that, but that's kind of what I got out of it, that God does not, I wouldn't go as so far as to say cannot maybe, but God chooses to not be able to perhaps force us to behave in a certain way. But God predestines God's self. And so if the fall was predestined, if this course of events that led to the good and the bad of who we are today was predestined, it is because God's behaviors, God's choices, God's actions were chosen by God, were promises that God made and decide and intends to fulfill, and not, in my view, a limitation of our choices. That's for me. And then I also wanted to read to you from John 17. This is just a couple of verses that are completely disconnected from each other, but John 17 is really long, and this is the prayer that Jesus prays in the garden on behalf of his disciples as he is grappling with the fact that his death is imminent. And he says, "So now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had in your presence before the world existed. Father, I desire that those also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory, which you have given me because you loved me before the foundation of the world." So this idea that, Jesus is God, or Christ is God. The Word, was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. And that participation of God in our suffering, in our world, um, makes us part of this idea of the love that was there for us before the foundation of the world. And so if we understand that even in the foundations of, who we are all meant to be, um, Jesus was there loving us, redeeming us, um, then I think it's all kind of bound up together into um, one beautiful, messy relationship. And we don't have to worry so much about questions like why do people suffer? Because even in that suffering, the redemption is there, which is not, not the answer we give when somebody is crying in front of us because they're suffering, obviously, but part of this kind of conversation. So, responses, anything?
Well, I like the way you ended it. And I like the way that you interpreted the first part about God, but God promises what he will do, not what we will do.
Yeah. Augustine is super angry somewhere right now because that is not what he meant at all, but that's what I took from it. And once you say something, you don't get to decide how people take it. So sorry.
Right. But that makes so much sense. I like that. And then, because you loved me before the foundation of the world, to think of, I mean, so Jesus was predestined to do the things that he did. But that doesn't mean that everybody is.
Well, and I think because he's kind of got the bizarre both sides of the relationship thing going on, right? Because he was the one who did the predestining and the one who had to act out that predestined event.
Yes.
But so in that case, he's also choosing, right? He's both
Right.
If you predestine yourself, then that's just a choice.
Right. Right. It makes sense. I like the ending. If you hadn't ended this way, I would have, because the whole idea of people being born to be put in a box, just, I don't know. I can't go there.
Yeah.
Just can't go there. But this brings it all together and fits more with what I think God should have done, would do, is doing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Karl Barth was really radical for in his time. But what he did with the idea of double predestination applying to Christ, I think was huge for theology across the board because it really returns this whole conversation back to where it belongs, which is on God and not on us. How dare God create me to be condemned or, whatever.
Right.
But it's not about us, right? It's about God and what God has done. And so the idea that God both did the predestining of Christ and participated in the fulfillment of that predestination in Christ is, what my little Augustine quote here, taken out of context, means. That God says, here's how I'm going to behave. I want to be in
Right.
a relationship with you. I love you. I've loved you since before the foundation of the world. Um, and I want you to be able to work out who you are. I want you to be able to work out, who who you want to be, but also know that I have laid out um, I have laid out things for you that will give you fulfillment, that will make you more you. And I think to me that's the gospel. That's the good news.
Yeah, I agree.
You got anything for us, Cindy?
Well, I'm just so glad that after a long hiatus, we had such an easy question.
Oh, I know. Who asked this question? It was terrible. Very difficult.
But it
Well,
really, you really brought it all together with this ending, because um it's kind of like any relationship you have with anybody. You have to decide what you're going to do, not what they're going to do.
mm-hmm.
It's just a foundational thing. And so God doing God things.
Yeah, right.
I really like that.
And it's always an imperfect uh, understanding because we can't really talk about God in a perfect way with the right
No.
words, but I feel like the tools that we have are the words of relationship, and so we use these images of the parental relationship or the friend relationship or the family relationship to try to understand these things, and all of that really fits. It makes sense
Yes,
when you think of it from that perspective.
I agree.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you. So next week or next time, which is now going to be on January 25th, will be our next one. Um, our next topic is what is a metaphysical Christian? And I got to tell you, I have no idea. So I'm glad that I have a little time to figure out what I'm going to say about this.
Yeah, I have no idea either.
But I'm sure it will bring some interesting things for us to talk about.
Yeah, no
All right.
doubt.
Well, thank you, friends, for
Thank
putting up
you.
with me for yet another one of these.
Well, I'm just glad we got to do it. And
Yes, thank you, Katie.
All right.